I always have to introduce myself by saying I'm from that state of Victoria, and people gasp now and wonder how people came through that era. Your Grace, it's wonderful to be here, fathers and ladies and gentlemen. It's a delight to be back in Hobart. It's my first time back in Hobart since COVID, so to see Martin and Catherine and all the wonderful, and Christine and all the people working down here, it's a great honour, and really, you really do kick above your weight down here, or punch above your weight. I'm not sure which it is, but anyway. It's wonderful also to be here with so many like minds who are interacting not only in the papers but in the discussions, and we've already had some great discussions already this morning. I do apologise for my voice. I'm just getting out of pneumonia. I was doing a whole week training program and caught pneumonia in the middle and spent 12 hours in Westmead Emergency Hospital, so that was a bit of fun. But I'm here, so I'm really pleased to be able to hear. It was wonderful to start today with a reminder of how wonderful Christopher Dawson is in giving us a direction in education and formation. Thanks to Carl, it was a wonderful paper and really tied together so many of the things that make Dawson important for the work that I'm currently doing, which is attempting to revive the Thomas More Centre, and I'll explain what that is as I go through. Dawson, in his wonderful book, 1961 book, The Crisis in Education, Western Education, aims his thought squarely into the hubris of modernity. This is 1961, you know, the space race, everything was going to be wonderful, the pill was being invented, all these technologies were going to remake humanity. He argued and warned not to lose the value of liberal arts and Catholic studies. He proposed a pedagogy of continuity in a time of disruption. And he warned even supposedly practicing Catholics to beware the direction of education. He argued that the West was slipping not only into being sub-religious, but sub-literary as well. I think Bella's paper on history has shown us the fruit of that. This is 1961, when these themes were not popular. There was other great Christian humanists like Dietrich von Hildebrand saying the same things from a German philosophical perspective, but it was very rare for Dawson, who wore the load and often got depressed about how different his voice was in the time that he lived. He argued that even within Catholic schools there was a temptation to secularism in education. And he said there were two tendencies. One was to be so busy fighting for bricks and mortar in the school, parish school, that we forgot about the content, about the context and historical context of the Western tradition. That's prescient, isn't it? I think many families and parents have told me that they sent their children to the Catholic schools that they worked so hard to build, trusting what was going on in the school. The second danger, he warned, was to accept the sectarian culture forces Christians, as well as Protestants, Catholics and Protestants, to accept the sectarian argument. And that means that you pursued your education within the closed doors of the conventicle and the home. In other words, closing in into a kind of ghetto. What we're trying to do in Thomas More is reverse that and take it out, but I'll explain that as I go through. And Dawson says, and thus we get a situation in which the Catholics who both practice and understand their religion are a minority of a minority. The majority of the population are neither freely Christian nor consciously atheist, but non-practicing Catholics, half Christians. 1961. How prescient and how important. So non-evangelised Catholics trotting along, not aware that the very institution they've dedicated and sacrificed so much for were no longer, even in 61, in the late 50s, doing the job. Dawson warned that there were two great threats to the West. One was, of course, totalitarian ideology, which, you know, we're looking at the brink of the Cold War. But the other was a kind of utilitarianism, which enabled Catholics to kind of plod on and divide their faith from their culture. And he pointed back to the tradition of Paideia, which is what I want to talk about today. The entire process of being a disciple in the New Testament, he pointed out, means an active learning and formation in the footsteps of the Rabboni, not just any teacher, but the master. Here the idea is that the disciple learns by following the way, not only a physical path or just the words of Jesus himself, but himself in a sacramental sense. With his love of Augustinian approaches to education, Dawson reminded us of the contribution of Plato to the development of who developed the original Athenian notion of the formation of the child, paideia, the pais being a child. And he could see already that there was echoes in the New Testament that brought those two traditions, the Hebrew and the Greek, together in a very fruitful way, including the formation of the person in virtue, in character, in well-rounded interests, and in a philosophical engagement with the cosmos. The other great Christian humanist, Henri Irénée Marou, wrote in 1948 that Paideia is not only an educational and formational process, but that the fruits of this formation, throughout the pith of the character of the person and through his life, change the person, but also bring fruits in the fulfilment of the polis, the community that you live in. There was, even in the Greek world, an expectation that the citizens building up the polis had been formed by a sound paideia. For Plato, and I can see already the themes that we've been discussing relate to this as well. For Plato, there was also an expectation that paideia converted and transformed the person in profoundly spiritual ways, as well as intellectual ones. And it's Dawson who points out that Plato pointed to the soul, turning to the good. So in the cave, the soul turns to the sun as an allegory for the divine source and the divine life. The logos, literally the formative principle of the soul. Dawson points out that this notion was very compatible with the early church's notion of formation and catechesis, whether for children or adults. And the great writer about Paideia, German scholar Werner Jaeger, did a 3-part study of Paideia. Some of you may have seen it. It's found in the library, at the Carolingism Library the other day, and I thought, wow, we've got that in 3 volumes. Somebody was on the ball in about 1948, I think, because the library is 100 years old this year, so the collection is still intact, but we're always trying to preserve it. The great study of Paideia argues that the tributaries of Greek culture of formation flowed into the fuller source deriving from the Hebrew world to position Christ as the Paideia. So it says Werner Jaeger. For instance, in the early church, he points out that Clement of Alexandria produced the work Paidagogos, which is a comprehensive educational study of how pagan classical education can be recruited into Plato's talk about the forms, along with Christian teaching about the moral, spiritual and sacramental discipleship with Christ. Isn't that amazing? It was such a rich, well-rounded thought, even in Clement's writings. Jaeger writes these telling and lovely lines. People who recovered Plato began to remember that it had been Plato who made the world of the soul visible for the first time to the inner eye of man, and they realised how radically this discovery changed human life, linking spiritual formation with intellectual formation. Now, of course, once the monastic scholars considered their own long life formation, it was transmitted via the humanitas of the Roman interpretation of Paideia into the forms of reading and the encounter of the mind with the text, interwoven into the monastery's ordo, Lectio Divina, reading, singing the Psalms. And it's interesting to reflect that this was not an abstract idea for the monk. There's something deeply physical, sacramental, aesthetic, iconographic, and forming of affectivity involved in monastic Paideia. based as it is on so many intimate and softly recited readings of the text. Someone made the comment that Ivan Illich said that monks were mumblers and munchers. And it's not an absolutely negative idea. In other words, they chewed the word, they sat listening to the word while they dined, and monks reading the Psalms in a soft sotto voce. So they would have been murmuring in their cells the words, chewing the words over and over again. And this creates a paideia of rich typology, an idea which reaches right back into Hebrew scriptures. If you ever see Orthodox Jews kind of dancing to the Torah, there's a kind of parallel in the Christian monastic life. And it brings images from the Hebrew scriptures into resonance with the New Testament and the literature of poetry. So by the time we get to Hugh of St. Victor, he calls the monastic life, the formation in the word, building a treasure chest of the heart. As one writer says, an elaborate mind palace comprising all of sacred and much of classical profane literature as well that could be recalled at an instant. What a very rich idea of education that is. And it's wonderful to see Dawson reflecting on the role of the link between classical education and monastic education. He says at one point, the only true humanism is a Christian humanism. And I think it resonates also in Pope Benedict's idea of the mustard seed being formed in that kind of monastic Benedictine tradition. So there's a great resonance across those writers, great Christian humanists, if you like. In addition, I think the monastic life added one further layer which was helpful, and that is the monastic ascetics along with its aesthetics. So enkratia, the discipline of recognising that we are fallen, the great sort of Christian humility of realising that we need reform and transformation. Very different from secular humanism. Louis Boyer, in his introduction to spirituality, says, the mastery of our sensibility by charity and agape in a soul given up in complete obedience to the faith. So the soul tempered by that recognition, by that humility. Louis Boyer comments that this was the rehearsal of the attention, the memory of God, and also an awareness that I'm not just fighting my own passions, but I'm fighting a spiritual warfare as well. There was a great awareness of that. And I would say that it's a paideia, this Christian paideia is, in addition to all the absorbing the best of the classics, is sacramental, it's festal, it's recuperative, and it's literary. Therefore think, there's a Benedict option deeply embedded in this need for paideia. I'm saying that as a Dominican tertiary, so there you go, that's ecumenism for you. Now, we know that the synthesis of classical and biblical formation is involved in this great revival we see of classical liberal arts education in the 21st century. There's a great deal of hope in this. I've just spent a week at Campion College forming some young people in a program called YPAT, and many of them are former Campion students, and they're just hungry to learn, hungry to grow, and they're really wonderful young people. We know that over the last 10 years there's been an exponential growth in alternative approaches to school and school-aged children. It is estimated that in the United States nearly 6 to 7% of children are homeschooled. And according to one survey, this rate is augmented by the reality of families who have sent 3 or more children into homeschooling programs or independent programs. They all homeschool together, in other words, as a family. There seems to be a growth in this in the United States. It's very clear and is now being noted in statistics. It's about a 10% growth annually since COVID. In the UK, there's a similar growth, but the number of homeschooled children is about 92,000 in 2022, although the COVID lockdown has greatly improved that. Even in Ireland, where the educational standards were until recently quite high, the home education network in Ireland has grown, it says, over the last 10 years, and the numbers of families opting for home education is growing, obviously with the great onslaught of secularism in Ireland, which has hit like a plague very suddenly and immediately. But what do we do for people who've left school and have never had an opportunity to be in classical or liberal arts study? What do we do to those people, as I call it, in the hearth and the road? How do we offer Paideia, formation, to those people, those who are planting themselves firmly in family, in friendship, neighbourhood and faith? How do we help them seek the lasting things offered in the quotidian rather than the ideological and bureaucratic world they see around them? I'm going to call one of these aspects of Paideia a Paideia of the hearth. And the word hearth often reminds us of heart, and that's appropriate. But for most Christians, their formation will be in their marriage, their work, or their family, the lay vocation, with some inspiring visits to monasteries and convents, I think, from time to time, as we see from the great pilgrimages that Archbishop down here has encouraged. I think that's a wonderful thing for lay people. The hearth is a really fascinating word in all languages etymologically. It's in Italian the foco, the word focolare means sitting around the hearth, the movement. Stratford Caldecott has a wonderful reflection in his great works on education. And he suggests that the hearth is the place where we learn logos, mythos, and grammar, the first part of the trivium. It's a wonderful suggestion in his book, The Beauty of the Word. He says it's around the hearth that we remember. We share anamnesis, that we remember who we are, where we've come from, that great point that Bella made about history. It's at the hearth around the table or around the hearth directly that stories and history are shared. It sounds very bardic, doesn't it? And it is in Caldecott's memory. He says the Hall of Rivendell represents the place where tradition is passed on through story, where meaning is revealed, where language expresses itself in the making and interpretation of worlds. The hearth is a place not of the ghetto, but of a wider hospitality. You invite people to the hearth. Last week, as part of YPAT, one of our organisers, Mark Makiewicz, who's a really budding theologian, brought his whole family down, including the baby. And the baby provided what Chesterton calls a justification for baby worship. The baby was never let down. The baby was held and passed around. And so I'd say that our Thomas More project is evolving not as a think tank, but as a kind of tank of ideas and hearth, the stirring of the hearth. It was a wonderful experience. Christopher Dawson I would call a personalist humanist, Christian humanist, and he saw that the great books would not do without an encounter with the personalities who wrote them and the personalities who interpreted them. In other words, we need to be formed by personal encounter. The Thomas More Centre began as the Thomas More Society in the late 1980s as a response to the startling recognition of literary, cultural and catechetical holes and lacunae, particularly amongst the staff at the St Vincent's Hospital where Dr Joe Santamaria worked. These staff were all fruit of Catholic schools, doctors, nurses, quite highly trained in their medical and nursing ability, but completely oblivious of Christian ethical formation. Dr Joe Natoli Santamaria and a number of his fellow senior doctors got together with Joe's very famous brother, B.A. Santamaria, and began to talk about this. Because it was an endeavour to bring together the best of the working minds of the era, other people were invited along to the discussion, notably Professor John Finnis, who was recruited to give an inaugural lecture. And the idea of the intensive summer schools, which ran from about 1990 to about 2005, came after a conversation around a hearth, I imagine, and probably a bottle of wine, with Professor Ralph McInerney, the great philosopher and novelist from Notre Dame University. Other relationships are what we might call a faculty on the road were formed and were forged by contributors to the magazine AD 2000, for instance, including defenders of mere Christianity in the Anglican and Orthodox traditions. So they sort of gathered like a snowball. They gathered a faculty as they went along. Some years after its formation, a very important contributor joined this faculty, and that was a certain Bishop George Pell, who'd been sort of parked with no jobs as an auxiliary bishop in Melbourne, so he made up for lost time. So I'm calling this the Paideia of the road and the hearth. In other words, they picked up people as they went who were working in a profession, but it also had a very strong focus on the importance of family and family relationships. The Thomas More Centre was therefore forged not just by great texts, but by key personalities, not merely by ideas coming into confluence in outstanding people's lives, but also brought together by an evangelising, world-striding Polish Pope, a generation of lay authors and literary revivals in which the Santa Marias had played an important part. The issue of catechesis and ethics, particularly bioethics, were to the fore in its initial vision. So, for instance, in the very first issue of their magazine, they said, "The Thomas More Society is a body of Australians of Christian conviction drawn from the various professions and social groupings with an aim to deepen the knowledge of Catholic faith and doctrinal," something Aidan Nichols calls lost doctrinal consciousness, to explore bioethical issues in accordance with authentic Catholic teaching, Christian teaching. It aimed to take on secular humanism in all its manifestations. Very cannily, it also wrote this: "Since the champions of secular humanist philosophy in these areas of bioethics use what may be called an interdisciplinary approach using the efforts of doctors, scientists, lawyers and journalists, we hope to do the same." Talk about towing the line. They're going to toe the line against the opposition by working interdisciplinary. Dawson comments in his great work over the history of education and cultural movement that the Italian Renaissance and growth began from a creative growth and inspiration around the Mediterranean, in a sense turning away from the Gothic northernness of the High Middle Ages, which we can already see in the genius of figures such as Dante and Fra Angelico from the 14th century. But I suggest that there was a Mediterranean influence in the growth of the Thomas More Centre too. In his rather whimsical biographical book, The Education of Dr. Joe Santamaria, who I worked for at the time, talks of the innate wisdom of his mother and father, two new Australians from the Aeolian Islands. Joe credits the deep faith of his mother and his father's ingenuity when he says, "Our parents moved easily in what was for them must have been a threatening experience, but they were able to do so because of an extended family and cultural links and by an environment which encouraged communal solidarity in a time of great social and economic stress." I can see a Paideia of the hearth at work here. His father Giuseppe and 4 other siblings started and grew a licensed grocery business. But Giuseppe also became the president of the very first Italian cultural club in Melbourne, the Aeolian Society, and the building's still there, and he was a keen member of the Cavour Club, another Italian club. For a time, Giuseppe drifted away from his faith, neither practising nor showing much interest. But then he became intensely involved again with the onset of the Depression and his awareness of the rise of totalitarianism of different flavours at the time. During the Second World War, Giuseppe became actively involved in organising events that both socially and educationally brought the Aeolian and the Italian community together, and he was invited onto Archbishop Daniel Mannix's Italian Welfare Committee, which was designed to accompany, to assist, and to provide educational opportunities for Italian families. Dr. Ilma Martezuni O'Brien writes, there's a great synthesis of cultures in one name, "The Aeolians have always been noted for their public-spiritedness, and in the very early days they formed their own associations to give comfort, aid and support to the Aeolians." Now, the Aeolian Islands are those little volcanic islands off Sicily, so most of the time you live in fear of it being smothered by scoria, and quite often people lived in quite a deal of famine on those islands. They're now very trendy, I believe, to go to, but they were places of real poverty in their earlier days. Effectively, the Santa Maria family and some of their friends created an intentional community and a creative minority, terms which they would never use in a million years, but which also brought along a rich social culture of family, music, cuisine. There's a great chapter in Dr. Joe's book about cooking livers and then forgetting he had them, and while he was in the hospital they got put into the mortuary fridge. Knitted together with a deep Catholic faith, became the foundations for Joe and Bob's separate vocations, and I'd say formed in the Hearth. In Joe's case, and I work with Joe, is that it led to medical leadership in founding the Department of Community Medicine. Joe observed that in the wonderful suburb of Fitzroy in Melbourne, alcoholics and drug addicts were coming in and out of the door in a kind of revolving door fashion, and he resolved to say we have to go upstream to find out what's causing this. And he created community medicine as a way of supporting people out of alcoholism. Quite an extraordinary achievement. It was a very unique centre. I would say a very early example of the culture of life, which John Paul II spoke of. He also worked in drug rehabilitation and brought those interests to the Australian Family Association. Joe was a real entrepreneur. Some of this was forged also in the experience of the Eucharistic Congress of 1973, in which Joe and Bob encountered Mother Teresa and Malcolm Muggeridge, the convert journalist. Not also forgetting that Bob Santa Maria also had a deep and personal friendship with the great Australian Tasmanian poet, James Macaulay. There's always been a Tasmanian link to some of this, including Senator Brian Harradine and Archbishop Eric Darcy, who spoke several times at Thomas More's events. By 1988, Joe joined forces with his famous brother and drew this circle of colleagues and friends to form the Thomas More Centre. I'll jump over a little bit because I hadn't had time to practice the timing of this, but you can see that the Thomas More Centre took off very quickly, and much to the organisers' surprise, attracted in its first few years over 100 young people who were looking for encounters where they could learn at the feet of people who were the speakers. So it was a very interesting experience. I ended up leaving St Vincent's and coming to work with Joe to try and get this remarkable response into some kind of order. So we were very clear that education outside of school, after school, for people in the ruck, as you might call it, was very important, and was also important to carry along forms of education which nurtured the intellect, the heart and the soul. It was lifelong and personal, and it steeps the baptised and even those just attracted in a wide range of encounters. It's important to mention too that Cardinal Pell was an important patron of this movement, and he brought to it his own particular taste in education, which he used to put under the title of conversazioni, having a conversation, again a bit of a Hearth, Paideia. He preached about saints often. He said you should have a conversation with the saints. And he often did this in visual forms, as he was a very engaged patron of the arts. He hired sculptors, he gave patronage to the painter Paul Newton, and if you go to the Domus Australia, you'll see all those paintings that he's commissioned of the saints, including St Mary MacKillop. As befitted his heroic proportions, he had a lively and generous interest in monumental yet dynamic and realist sculpture. Isn't it interesting, Bella, that the statues of the things being cut down, they're too real. The great feature of medieval art in the churches was sculpture. Cardinal Pell put an enormous sculpture of Dr. Mannix in the foyer of St Patrick's Cathedral. So these figures are real. And also, he wanted to erect statues that reminded different communities of their patron saints. So there's some marvellous community statues on the other side of the cathedral of St Catherine of Siena and St Francis of Assisi. They're very beautiful statues. But again, I suppose we live in fear that even St Catherine might get cut down if someone has the will to do it. He rightly saw that these works left a lasting, monumental and powerful lesson in bronze for the church and for society. When he went to Sydney as cardinal, he commissioned a large bronze of none other than Thomas More, designed by a Dutch-born sculptor called Louis Lehmann. The statue is in the gardens was placed in the gardens of Parliament House, right outside Parliament House. You can't take it up to Parliament House more directly than to put a statue of Thomas More outside it. And he donated it to the Houses of Parliament to mark the 150 years of the responsible government in the Australian saint. So using art to send a message. He said, "I congratulate the sculpture on capturing More's spirit. I believe that this beautiful place will always be a silent but powerful reminder of the need for high principles, service to the truth, and above all, moral courage," if that's not a statement of classic civilian Paideia, I don't know what is. So teaching through uses of art. Within the first few years of the Thomas More Centre and its expanding annual summer schools, George Pell, as Bishop and then Archbishop of Melbourne, began using the audiences as a kind of formational initiative, and he began rehearsing some of his texts with these young people. He wrote in his Issues in Faith and Morals that the events and their audiences had provided him with a valuable and welcoming place in which to explore his conversational approach. He said, marrying contemporary Australian concerns with a mature understanding of Catholic teaching. Now to St Thomas. Why St Thomas More? When the elders of the Thomas More Centre first began, they actually called it the Thomas More Society, and then realised that they'd annoyed the Catholic lawyers of New South Wales, whose society had long been dedicated to St Thomas. So they quickly did a quick name change and called themselves the Thomas More Centre. And it's providential. This is quite remarkable. But today being the octave day of the feast of St Peter and Paul is what? Is exactly the day on which St Thomas More was executed today. So in 1535. And the night before he said to his beloved daughter, Margaret, "I cumber you, Margaret, much, that I would be sorry, for it is St Thomas Eve, and the Eutas, the octave, of St Peter, and tomorrow I long to be with God, if there be a day very meet and convenient." So today is St Thomas More's death day, even though his feast day is on the 22nd. So he is obviously a leading figure in the humanist Renaissance in the Northern Europe. He represents, for Christopher Dawson, who saw still a unity of Christianity in the Northern Renaissance, even though, there were Protestants in that movement, particularly Calvinists. He saw that as destructive as the Reformation was, it didn't quite remove the Christian nature of humanism. So he saw Calvin, for instance, for all his errors, still preserving a devotion to truth and goodness. But he also saw, particularly in this Paideia of Plato, this educational idea of Plato's in its Christian form, the special place of the friends of Christian humanism in the North, particularly St Thomas More. But also his great friends, Colet and Erasmus and others. His great friend with the singular martyr from the English bishop, St John Fisher, who introduced the study of Greek at Cambridge, where he was elected Chancellor, eventually Chancellor for life, and part of the formation of St Thomas More himself at Oxford before he became a lawyer. So how amazing is that I don't think Joe knew that when he formed the Thomas More Centre, but I'm just thinking what a remarkable confluence of great heroes of Christian humanism that was. Renaissance education with the recovery of Greek and Latin classical texts, drama, philosophy, poetry, then was surviving and thriving at the English universities, especially under the support of St John Fisher. Thomas was formed in a creative melting pot, which I think embodies what we're trying to do with the 21st century version of Thomas More, and that is, first of all, he wasn't formed in the first place in the rowdy, vaunting Tudor court. He resided as a young man in the London Charterhouse, back to that monastic Paideia, in the austere spiritual gold mine of Carthusian life, where he considered for a time a priestly vocation. And it's here that he developed his own lay version of an inner aesthetic. He wore a hair shirt. He saw that he was in need of reform. He prayed for forgiveness. He had a devotion to prayer and the Psalms. The French historian Pierre Allard writes, when he eventually married and he was at 27, when his children were old enough to get a formal education, Moore decided to see their education at home. He might be the patron saint of homeschoolers as well as everything else. He opened his home school not just to his own family, but to young relatives. They fostered a child, and the children of the neighbourhood, the handmaids and the servants. We were telling the story of St Thomas More to some little kids last week, and I asked them to think of emblems that they'd like to see of St Thomas, and I told the story of his household and his education, and they said, could we have jesters juggling balls? Because he employed his jester to educate the children and probably to keep him humble. So within that expansive household, Thomas created a homeschool in his London home, and part to provide a centre in which his beloved daughters Margaret, Meg, Elizabeth and Cecily, along with a son John, could be guaranteed formation that pursued domestic tasks along with advanced learning in medicine, classics, languages, scripture study and shared prayers. St Thomas even encouraged Meg to study medieval sciences, including medicine, totally unknown at that time for women to be pursuing this education. Something quite unique at the time. My husband Anthony pointed out something a bit ironic, and that both More and Henry VIII taught their daughters to very, very different effects. Henry VIII taught Elizabeth, who was well educated, but not quite in the kind of humanism we might have expected. He was convinced, Thomas, of the high theology of marriage, bolstered by a deeply loving and happy relationship, first of all with his first wife, and at her death with the widow Dame Alice, who unfortunately is somewhat caricatured in the public imagination, particularly in A Man for All Seasons, where she's a bit of a grumpy character. Dame Alice, in fact, served as the type of manager of the home school, and she looked after the smooth running of hospitality and the timetables. So anyone who's looking at getting a timetable at school, look to Dame Alice. She was an interesting character. The More family was not in any way what Dawson derided as a ghetto. It was open to some of the most needy, some of the poor, and the family managed on the side as a project, if you like, a small almshouse. So the children had to be involved in the almshouse feeding the poor as part of their education. Pretty amazing. And some of the more prestigious people at the time also dropped in, notably Holbein and Erasmus, who came just to see how this thing worked. Thomas More also had a deep understanding that the common good of the wider society was grounded in the domestic common good and integrity and flourishing of the house. And it's clear that such conviviality and humour that is written about by Erasmus was also the fire that lit that hearth in the More household. It was a home-ground creative minority, the type of base that we hope to see and encourage in the work we're doing in the Thomas More Centre today.